"Leave that woman alone," Sarah Jane Miller snapped. The gilded horseshoe fell silent. Every fork stopped in midair. She planted herself between a trembling old woman and Evelyn Thorne. Evelyn was the most feared society lady in all of Virginia City. Sarah Jane's stained white apron carried the marks of years spent serving meals and scrubbing floors. Her dark blue work dress was faded at the elbows. Her hands were red from the relentless work of the frontier, but she stood straighter than anyone else in the crowded room. Evelyn pointed a sharp, gloved finger at her. "You are nothing but a fat, ignorant servant," she hissed. Move aside before I have you thrown into the street." Sarah Jane knew exactly what refusing would cost her. Her injured father was waiting at home in a drafty cabin. His medicine bottle was almost empty. The firewood was running dangerously low. This job was the only thing keeping him out of the county poorhouse. Still, Sarah Jane did not step aside. She placed one protective, steady hand on the old woman's shoulder. "If defending her costs me my job," she said, "then this was never a place worth working for." What Sarah Jane did not know was that a black carriage had just stopped outside. The young millionaire who stepped from it had spent years searching for a ghost. He had spent a fortune looking for the frail woman Sarah had chosen to protect. Before the morning ended, everyone in the saloon would know the truth. The man who came through those doors would never forget this courageous waitress. He would never forget the woman who stood beside his mother when the world turned cold. To understand how Sarah Jane risked everything, we must return to the beginning of that day. It was early October of 1875. The Comstock boom was at its height. Virginia City still rested in the deep, biting shadow of Mount Davidson. The silver mills had already begun their relentless, mechanical pounding. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was the heartbeat of a city built on greed and stone. Sarah Jane stepped onto the porch of her small, weathered cabin. She pulled a heavy wool shawl around her broad, capable shoulders. The cold Nevada air stung her cheeks. She barely noticed the bite of the wind. She had endured much harder things than a mountain morning. Before beginning her long shift, she went back inside to check on her father. The cabin smelled of cedar, old books, and the lingering scent of liniment. Ben Miller lay in a narrow bed beside the stone hearth. A mining accident 3 years earlier had shattered his life. A cave-in had crushed his hip and badly damaged his left leg. Once, he was a powerful man who could move mountains. Now, he needed a heavy walnut cane merely to stand. And pain had hollowed his face and grayed his hair, but the mountain had not taken away his pride. Sarah Jane stirred the dying embers with an iron poker. She added a fresh cedar log to the grate. She placed a cup of fresh water within his reach. Then she checked the small brown bottle of laudanum. Only a few drops remained at the bottom. The liquid was as precious as the silver pulled from the earth. "I'm leaving for my shift, Pa," she whispered. Ben stirred beneath his worn, patched blanket. "You work too hard." "Sarah," he muttered. "I work exactly as hard as I need to," she replied. She bent down and kissed his papery forehead. Years ago, she had made a solemn promise. She promised he would never be abandoned in the county poorhouse. Sarah Jane intended to keep that promise until her last breath. She walked down the frost-hardened, rutted streets toward the center of the city. Virginia City was a place of stark contrasts. Millionaires slept beneath silk blankets in mansions on the hill. Miners risked their lives in the steaming darkness a mile below the earth. Sarah Jane wanted no mansion. She wanted no imported lace or French silk. She wanted medicine for her father's pain. She wanted food for their small, wooden table. She wanted enough firewood to survive the coming winter storms. The Gilded Horseshoe was already crowded when she arrived. Though it was known as a saloon, its front dining room served one of the most popular breakfasts in Virginia City. The smell of black coffee and salt pork filled the air. Tobacco smoke hung in thick, gray clouds near the ceiling. Sarah Jane tied her stained white apron over her dark blue dress. She lifted the first heavy tray of the morning. Some of the other waitresses mocked her behind her back. They called her the mountain because of her size. They whispered about her strength and her simple clothes. Sarah Jane ignored their petty, childish words. Her body had carried heavy burdens, but it had never made her cruel. She poured coffee for exhausted miners with bloodshot eyes. She brought hot porridge to young mine workers coming off the night shift. Then, she noticed her. An elderly woman sat alone in the coldest corner of the room. She sat tucked in a shadow, nearly invisible. She wore a tattered, thin brown shawl. Her fingers were gnarled like the roots of an old tree. She held a single cup of tea. The liquid had already gone cold and pale. Sarah Jane knew this woman's face. Her name was Martha. Martha lived in a leaning shack on the edge of the canyon. Most people in the city treated her like a ghost. They looked through her as if she were made of glass. Sarah Jane walked over with a gentle smile. "Morning, Martha," she said softly. She placed a fresh, buttered biscuit on the table. The steam rose from the biscuit, smelling of butter and warmth. "I can't pay for that, dear," Martha whispered. Her voice was faint and unsteady, like a flickering candle. "It's on me today," Sarah Jane replied. She kept her voice low so the owner wouldn't hear. The cook made an extra one by mistake. Sarah Jane would pay for it later from her own small collection of tips. Martha's eyes filled with sudden, stinging tears. "You're a good girl, Sarah Jane Miller. The world doesn't always reward a heart like yours." Sarah Jane patted the old woman's hand. "Eat up, Martha. You'll need your strength." Suddenly, the heavy doors of the saloon struck the walls. The cold mountain air rushed into the room. Evelyn Thorne marched inside with the confidence of a predator. She wore a dress of shimmering golden silk. The fabric hissed along the floorboards with a soft rustle. Her hat was adorned with expensive, long ostrich feathers. Two other ladies followed her like obedient shadows. They were laughing at a private, cruel joke. They looked for a table away from the filth of the miners. Evelyn pulled her expensive skirts close to her body. She did not want to touch the common people. The only empty table was directly next to Martha. Evelyn Thorne stopped in her tracks. She wrinkled her nose in visible, dramatic disgust. "What is that absolutely awful smell?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was sharp. It cut through the chatter of the room like a blade. She looked down at Martha with cold, blue eyes. "This is a place for respectable people," Evelyn said. "It is not a shelter for beggars and tramps. Remove her before she ruins everyone's appetite." The room went deathly silent. The miners lowered their forks. Martha shrank into her hard wooden seat. She tried to pull her thin shawl tighter. She tried to become invisible. "Please, I was just finishing my tea," Martha stammered. She pointed a gloved finger at the trembling woman. "You are a blight on this establishment. Go back to the gutter where you belong." Heat rose through Sarah Jane's chest. She set down her tray and stepped forward. Each step sounded like a drumbeat on the wood. "Leave that woman alone," Sarah Jane snapped. The words echoed against the high, timbered ceiling. Watching Sarah Jane risk her livelihood to protect one hungry woman's dignity, I cannot help thinking about how close that choice still feels today. In July 2026, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that grocery prices were 2.7% higher and shelter costs 3.2% higher than a year earlier, a reminder that one missed paycheck can still upend an American family's life. But Sarah Jane had no statistics before her that morning. She saw only a frightened woman who deserved not to stand alone. Amos Reed, the owner of the saloon, hurried over. He nervously stroked his thin mustache, which was damp with sweat. Panic filled his eyes as he looked at Evelyn Thorne. "Sarah Jane, mind your tongue." "Do you have any idea who this is?" "I know exactly who she is," Sarah Jane said. "She did not move an inch. She is a bully who has forgotten how to be human." Evelyn's face turned a bright, pulsing red. "How dare you speak to me that way? You are nothing but a common servant. You are a zero in this world, and you always will be." Sarah Jane looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. She saw the expensive lace and the blankness around her eyes. "I may be a waitress," Sarah said calmly, "but I won't stand by while you hurt a defenseless woman." Evelyn turned to Amos with eyes like slits of fury. "Fire her. Fire her this very instant. If she is still here in 5 minutes, I will act. My husband will pull his accounts from this place. You will be bankrupt by sunset." Amos looked at Sarah Jane with regret. His pockets were empty, and his courage failed him. "I'm sorry, Sarah Jane," he whispered, "but please, just go home before this gets worse." Sarah Jane did not cry or beg for her livelihood. She untied her heavy apron and folded it neatly on the grease-stained counter. Then she walked back to Martha and put a strong arm around the old woman's shoulders. "Come on, Martha, we're leaving this cold place. We'll find somewhere with better company." As they approached the door, Evelyn reached into her purse. She tossed a small silver coin onto the dirty floor. The coin struck the wood and spun between them. "There," Evelyn sneered. "Buy yourself some soap. You both clearly need it." Sarah Jane stopped at the threshold. She looked down at the silver coin, then turned back toward Evelyn. "Keep your money, Mrs. Thorne. You clearly need it much more than we do, and you certainly can't buy respect with your husband's name." They stepped out into the freezing morning air. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. Sarah Jane led Martha to a weathered wooden bench. The bench sat near the warmth of the livery stable. The smell of hay and horses was thick and earthy. "I'm so sorry, dear." Martha sobbed into her hands. "You lost your job because of a worthless old woman." Sarah Jane took a deep, steadying breath. The cold air cleared her mind. "Jobs come and go, Martha, but my dignity stays right here in my chest." Suddenly, a magnificent black carriage pulled up. It was polished to a high, mirror-like shine. The horses were fine-blooded, powerful stallions. A young man stepped from the carriage with quiet authority. He was tall and broad-shouldered. He had wind-tossed dark hair and a closely trimmed beard. He wore a tailored black wool coat over a dark waistcoat. His storm-blue eyes found the two women. Then he froze. "Mother," he whispered. The word was barely a breath. Martha looked up with watery, tired eyes. She stood up on shaky, uncertain legs. "Julian, is that really my boy?" The man ran to her through the frozen mud. He threw his arms around the frail, tattered woman. He held her as if she might shatter in his arms. "Mother, I've been looking everywhere for you for years. Every letter I sent to the old cabin came back unopened," Julian said. "When I learned you had moved, I hired men to search every camp between Virginia City and Carson. Someone told me you had gone east with relatives. I did not learn the truth until yesterday." Martha was crying openly now. These were happy tears that washed away years of sorrow. "I thought you were gone from this world. Julian, I'm here, Mother. And I'm never leaving you again. I'm a wealthy man now. I struck a rich vein in one of my claims. I invested wisely while the Comstock was booming. I have more than enough to make sure you are never cold again." He looked at her tattered shawl with horror. "What happened here today?" he asked. His voice turned serious and cold. Martha pointed a trembling hand toward the saloon. "A lady in there. She was so mean to me, Julian. She called me a tramp." Julian's jaw tightened. "And who is this woman?" he asked. He looked at Sarah Jane Miller. "This is Sarah Jane," Martha said. "She's an angel in a faded cotton dress. She stood up for me when the world turned away. She lost her job because she protected me." Julian looked deep into Sarah Jane's eyes. He saw the incredible strength in her face. He saw the quiet, unwavering kindness in her soul. He bowed his head in a gesture of deep respect. "Thank you, Tup," he said. His voice was thick with raw emotion. "You protected my mother when I was not here. I will never forget this act as long as I live." Sarah Jane felt her face heat up with a rare blush. "I only did what was right, sir." Julian turned back toward the saloon doors. His expression hardened with quiet purpose. "Wait here for me," he said. He walked toward the heavy oak doors. Inside the gilded horseshoe, Evelyn Thorne was still talking. She sipped her tea, her pinky lifted in a show of arrogance. She was laughing about the waitress and the old woman. Amos Reed hovered nearby, small and anxious. The doors struck the walls as Julian Vance entered. For the second time that morning, the saloon fell silent. Everyone in Virginia City knew the name of Julian Vance. His mining interests and timber contracts had made him one of the wealthiest young men on the Comstock. Evelyn Thorne stood up quickly. She put on her most charming, painted-on smile. "Mr. Vance. What a wonderful surprise." Julian did not smile back. He walked right up to her table. "Mrs. Thorne, I believe we have business." "Yes, We met at the ball in Carson City, she chirped. She reached out a gloved hand for him to kiss. Julian ignored the hand as if it didn't exist. You just insulted a woman in this room. You called her a tramp and a creature of the gutter. Evelyn's smile faltered at the edges like burnt paper. Oh, it was a misunderstanding. A dirty beggar was bothering the patrons. That woman is my mother, Julian roared. The words seemed to stop every breath in the room. The teacup slipped from Evelyn's hand and shattered. Hot tea splashed across her golden silk skirt. The color drained from her face. Your mother. Julian turned his stern gaze toward Amos Reed. The owner was shaking like a leaf in a gale. You fired the woman who defended her. You chose a bully over a hero. I didn't know. Amos stammered. I had to save my business. Thorne threatened me. Julian raised one hand and stopped him. I will purchase this establishment once the papers are drawn. I will make you a fair offer once the property records and mortgage have been examined. Amos blinked in absolute, paralyzed shock, effective immediately. Sarah Jane Miller will return as manager. She will have full wages and a share of the profits. If she accepts the responsibility, she will also have the first opportunity to purchase it on fair terms. He turned his cold, hard eyes back to Evelyn Thorne. My companies hold several contracts with your husband's mine. Those contracts will be reviewed tomorrow morning. If either of you uses those contracts to threaten these people again, I will take my business elsewhere when the agreements expire. You will apologize to my mother and to Sarah Jane, and you will do it in front of everyone you tried to turn against them. Evelyn looked as if she might faint from shame. Several miners watched with quiet satisfaction. Apologize, Julian said. His quiet voice left no doubt that he expected an answer. Evelyn stepped outside under every eye in the saloon. The wind bent the expensive feathers on her hat. She stopped before Martha and Sarah Jane. I am sorry, she whispered, her eyes dropping away. What I said was cruel. Neither of you deserved it. Sarah Jane looked at her with a heavy heart. She felt no triumph, only sadness. Go home, Mrs. Thorne, Sarah Jane said softly. The world is far too cold to be this mean to others. Julian came out and stood tall beside them. Mother, let's go home to warmth. I have a house on the hill waiting for you. Then, he turned his gaze to Sarah Jane. He told her about the offer to manage the saloon. Sarah Jane felt the tears finally come, hot and sweet. For the first time, someone was giving back to her. I will manage the place, Sarah Jane said, but only if I earn every dollar and make every decision about who comes in. Julian smiled. Warm and genuine, I would expect nothing less. Will you come with us for a meal? I want to hear about your dreams. Sarah Jane looked towards her small cabin. I have to check on my father first. He needs his medicine. Then we will bring the medicine and the meal to him, Julian promised. And we will ask a good doctor what can be done for his pain. I can promise him proper care, even if I cannot promise a miracle. The weeks that followed were like a golden dream. The Gilded Horseshoe was renamed the Miller House. It became a place of refuge and dignity. Sarah Jane was no longer just a struggling waitress. She was a leader in the community. She made sure no one was ever turned away hungry. If you were poor, you still ate like a king at her table. Julian visited her regularly at the Miller House. At first, Sarah Jane kept a careful distance. She had seen wealthy men mistake generosity for ownership. She refused to become anyone's obligation. Julian never pressed her. He helped Ben practice standing beside the cabin wall. He carried firewood when Sarah Jane was working. He listened while Martha told stories of the past. Sarah Jane began to notice small things. Julian remembered how Ben preferred his coffee. He spoke respectfully to miners covered in dust. When a hungry child entered, Julian quietly paid for the meal. One evening, they sat together in the fading light. You do not have to prove your worth to me, Julian said. Sarah Jane studied his tired, honest face. Then do not try to rescue me. Julian nodded. I would rather stand beside you. That was the moment she realized his kindness was real. She sat in the back room one afternoon, sewing. Every piece carries a memory, she told Julian. She touched a blue patch in her unfinished quilt. This came from the shirt Pa wore in the mines. The yellow came from one of my mother's dresses. I suppose a family is made the same way. Different lives are joined together until they keep someone warm. Julian watched her strong, steady hands move. You have a beautiful soul, Sarah Jane. But the Nevada frontier was an unpredictable place. In October of 1875, tragedy struck the city. It began before dawn in a crowded boarding house on A Street. A coal oil lamp had reportedly been knocked over. The fierce Washoe Zephyr wind carried the flames from roof to roof. The city was made of dry wood and forgotten dreams. Within an hour, the great fire was out of control. Sarah Jane was at the Miller house when she heard the bells. The iron bells clanged in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Fire, fire on the hill. She ran to the door and saw the sky turning black and orange. She thought of her father, Ben. He was alone in the cabin at the edge of town. Sarah Jane ran straight into the choking smoke. People were screaming in the narrow streets. Horses were bolting in blind terror. She pushed through the panicked crowd. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath. She finally reached her weathered cabin. The roof was already catching flying orange sparks. Pa, she screamed, burst through the door. The room was filled with a thick, suffocating haze. Ben Miller was on the floor, trying to crawl. Sarah Jane, go, Ben gasped. Save yourself, Nep. She pulled a heavy wool blanket from the bed. She spread it on the floor beside him, using all her strength. She rolled Ben onto it. She began to drag him toward the door. The ceiling creaked above them, showering sparks. She reached the porch, but the steps were burning. A miner named Thomas Hale appeared through the smoke. "Smoke, take his shoulders," Sarah Jane shouted. Together, they lifted Ben and carried him across the street. The cabin roof collapsed behind them with a roar. Sarah Jane supported her father as they climbed the slope. They reached a rocky outcrop far above the flames. They watched without speaking. The city they loved turned into an ocean of fire. Nearly 2,000 structures were destroyed. The banks and mansions turned to gray ash. The Miller house survived. Its roof was scorched and several windows had shattered in the heat. Sarah Jane sat in the dirt and wept for her city. She had lost her home and her beautiful quilt, but she held her father's hand in the dark. "We're alive, Pa," she whispered. A shadow fell over them as the sun set. Julian was standing there, a silhouette of hope. His expensive coat was scorched, torn, and blackened with soot. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice breaking. He fell to his knees and pulled them into an embrace. The fire had taken buildings and years of labor, but it could not take what was real between them. In the months that followed, Virginia City rebuilt. It rose from the ashes stronger than before. Sarah Jane reopened the Miller house as soon as the roof was repaired. For weeks, its kitchen fed workers who were rebuilding homes they no longer owned. Julian rebuilt his home on safer, higher ground, using stone and brick wherever practical. Martha moved into a warm room overlooking the valley. Bun accepted a room only after Julian gave him a job. Ben would help with the household accounts. Sarah Jane did not move in until Julian asked her to be his wife. By then, the four of them were already a family. Julian and Sarah Jane were married in the spring. The hillsides were dotted with hardy spring wildflowers. The ceremony was small and quiet. Sarah Jane wore a simple white dress she had sewn. She carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers. It was tied with a strip of blue cloth from her quilt. Martha sat in the front row, wearing a new wool shawl. Ben Miller rose carefully with his walnut cane. Months of treatment had eased some of his pain. With Julian supporting one arm, Bun walked his daughter. He cried openly when he gave her away. Sarah Jane looked into her husband's eyes. She realized her body had never made her less worthy. The world had tried to turn her size into a burden, but she had carried it with strength and dignity. They lived a long, prosperous, and happy life. Their children grew up learning a simple lesson. Never judge a tired face or a stained apron. Never look down on a woman in a tattered shawl. Years later, the silver beneath the mountain faded. The deep mines eventually closed their heavy doors. But the Miller house remained open to all. A pot of stew still warmed the stove for the hungry. Above the doorway hung one simple line: kindness is the only currency that never loses its value. The story of the waitress and the quilt endured as a reminder of love, sacrifice, and the courage to stand up for what is right. This fictional Western romance is inspired by the hardships and resilience of 19th century frontier life. Its characters and events have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. AI tools may have assisted with parts of the production. The final story and presentation were reviewed and directed by the channel creator. If Sarah Jane's courage touched your heart, please tell us where you're listening from. Subscribe for more stories of love, dignity, and second chances in the American West.